Lyon, France. September 1942. The smell of fresh bread still lingered in the air on Rue de la République, though the bakery had been closed for hours. Marguerite Moreau walked past its shuttered windows without looking, her worn shoes clicking softly against cobblestones that had witnessed 4 centuries of footsteps. She was 23 years old. She carried a basket of vegetables that hid, beneath wilted lettuce leaves, a stack of forged ration cards. The occupation had been in place for 2 years. Long enough that the sight of German uniforms no longer caused startled gasps, only a tightening of jaws, a quickening of pace. Long enough that collaboration had become a quiet epidemic, spreading through neighborhoods like damp through old walls. Long enough that those who resisted had learned to wear their defiance beneath layers of normalcy. Marguerite had been recruited 6 months earlier by her cousin, a pharmacist named Henri who spoke in whispers and never wrote anything down. The resistance in Lyon was fragmented, cautious, composed of small cells that operated independently so that if one was discovered, the others might survive. Her cell had 11 members. They printed leaflets on a hidden press, helped Allied airmen reach Spain, gathered intelligence on German troop movements. She had joined not from ideology but from something simpler and more stubborn, the memory of her father's face when German soldiers requisitioned his printing shop. The way he had stood silent, hands trembling, watching strangers dismantle his life's work. The way he had died 3 months later, not from violence but from something broken inside that no doctor could repair. Resistance, for Marguerite, was a form of remembering. A refusal to let that silence be the final word. The apartment where her cell met was on the 3rd floor of a building near the Saône River. The old woman who lived there, Madame Benoit, was 81 and had survived the Franco-Prussian War as a child. She served them weak tea and sat knitting while they discussed sabotage as if they were planning a church social. Tonight's meeting was brief. A British pilot needed safe passage. Documents needed to be moved from one safe house to another. Someone had heard rumors of a new Gestapo officer arriving in Lyon, known for his efficiency in breaking resistance networks in Paris. Henri distributed assignments with his usual precision. Marguerite's task was simple: deliver a package to a contact who worked as a clerk in the German administrative offices. The contact would hide it among legitimate paperwork, allowing sensitive intelligence to be photographed and passed along. It was routine. One of dozens of small acts of defiance that kept the network alive. Nothing suggested this night would be different from any other. Marguerite left the apartment at 8:30, the package tucked into her coat pocket. The streets were emptying as curfew approached. German patrols increased after dark, and anyone caught outside needed a convincing reason or impeccable false papers. She had both. The October air carried the first edge of winter. Street lamps cast pools of weak yellow light. In the distance, a radio played German music from an officer's café, the melody drifting incongruously through the French night. She walked with purpose but not haste. The key to survival, Henri always said, was to appear as though you belonged exactly where you were. As if your presence required no explanation. She did not yet know that in 3 weeks, everything she believed about loyalty, about love, about the clear line between enemy and human being, would begin to dissolve like morning fog under an unforgiving sun. The contact's name was Lucien Arnaud. He worked in the Bureau of Civil Affairs, a dull administrative office where birth certificates were processed, housing permits issued, and the mundane machinery of occupation ground forward. He had been passing information to the resistance for 8 months. Minor things mostly. Troop deployment schedules. The names of collaborators receiving payments. Anything he could photograph during his lunch hour when the office was empty. Marguerite was supposed to meet him in the Parc de la Tête d'Or at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The park remained open during occupation, though its beauty felt like a rebuke, all that careful landscaping persisting while the world fractured around it. She arrived early and sat on a bench near the botanical gardens. The day was cold but clear. A few nurses from the nearby hospital walked past, their white caps bright against the gray sky. An elderly man fed pigeons despite regulations against wasting food. At 2:15 Lucien had not arrived. At 2:30 Marguerite felt the first flutter of concern. Lucien was punctual to the point of compulsion. Lateness meant problems. At 2:45 she stood to leave. Protocol was clear. If a contact failed to appear, you abandoned the meeting and reported to your cell leader. Never wait. Never improvise. She was turning away from the bench when she heard footsteps behind her and a voice, accented but clear, speaking French. Mademoiselle, excuse me. I believe you dropped this. She turned. The man holding out a handkerchief, one that was not hers, wore a German Wehrmacht uniform. The gray-green fabric, the eagle insignia, the boots polished to a dark shine. Everything about him announced enemy. But his face. His face was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of open expression that seemed incompatible with the uniform he wore. He smiled slightly, apologetically, and gestured with the handkerchief as if genuinely believing it belonged to her. Marguerite understood immediately. This was the contact. Lucien had been compromised. Arrested, transferred, perhaps dead. This German soldier was taking his place. The recognition must have shone in her eyes because the soldier's smile steadied, became less apologetic and more certain. He spoke again, quieter now. The roses in the botanical garden are especially beautiful this time of year. Perhaps you would walk with me? It was the agreed-upon phrase. The sign that he was the new link in the chain. Every instinct told her to run. This was impossible. The resistance did not work with German soldiers. It could not. The entire foundation of what they did rested on clear lines. Us and them, occupied and occupier, French and German. But Henry's voice echoed in her memory, the only absolute is survival. Everything else adapts. She took the handkerchief. Thank you. That's very kind. They walked slowly through the park, keeping a careful distance that would appear casual to any observer. His name, he told her quietly, was Klaus Richter. He was from Bavaria, a small town near Munich that she would never have heard of. He had been conscripted 3 years ago, sent first to Poland, then to France. He worked now as a translator in the civil offices, a position that kept him away from combat but gave him access to countless documents. He had begun passing information to a resistance contact 8 months ago, the same time Lucien had started. In fact, Lucien had never been the source. Lucien had only been the messenger between Klaus and the resistance network. 2 days ago, Lucien had been arrested. Not for resistance work but for black market trading. A stupid mistake. Under interrogation he had given names. Klaus knew his own was likely among them. He had perhaps a week before suspicion fell on him completely. In that week he wanted to deliver everything he knew, everything that might help end this war faster. Marguerite listened, her mind working frantically. This violated every security protocol. Meeting alone. Accepting a new contact without verification. Trusting a German soldier whose story might be an elaborate trap. Yet something in the way Klaus spoke, the quiet desperation beneath his careful words, felt genuine. And more pragmatically, if this was a trap, she was already caught. The Gestapo would have taken her the moment she acknowledged the signal. They arranged to meet again in 3 days. Same location, earlier in the afternoon. He would bring documents, photographs if possible. She would verify their value and establish a new channel for delivery. As they parted near the park entrance, Klaus said something that would echo in her mind for weeks. I do not ask you to trust me. Only to let me help end this. She walked home through streets that looked the same but felt different. The occupation had been a landscape of clear moral geography. Now a crack had appeared in that certainty, narrow but deep, and she did not yet know what might grow in it. The documents Klaus provided at their second meeting were extraordinary. Detailed records of German supply routes, Wehrmacht unit deployments, the locations of ammunition depots and fuel reserves throughout the region. Henri examined them with barely concealed astonishment. This was intelligence that could alter the course of Allied operations, information that lives depended on. Where did you say this came from? Henri asked, turning over a photograph of what appeared to be construction plans for defensive fortifications. A new source, Marguerite said carefully. Someone inside the civil administration. Henri looked at her for a long moment. You verified they're reliable? The information appears accurate. That's not what I asked. She held his gaze. I trust the source. It was not quite a lie. She did trust that Klaus wanted the war to end. Whether that was the same as trusting him, she was still determining. The meetings continued. Once a week, sometimes twice, always in public places where two people talking might appear coincidental. The Parc. A café frequented by both French civilians and off-duty German soldiers. The botanical garden when weather permitted. Klaus brought information. Marguerite brought questions from her cell, specific intelligence needs, gaps in their knowledge. The arrangement was professional, efficient. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the immediate exchange. But certain moments accumulated despite their carefulness. The afternoon Klaus mentioned his mother's letters, how she wrote about the garden she was maintaining in Bavaria, planting vegetables in soil that had once grown only flowers. The quiet pride in her words about enduring, about making beauty in difficult times. The day Marguerite spoke of her father without meaning to, the words emerging before she could stop them. Klaus had asked why she took such risks, and she found herself describing the printing shop, the trembling hands, the death that came not from bullets but from broken dignity. I am sorry, Klaus said quietly. This war takes more than it knows. They did not touch. They maintained the careful distance of casual acquaintances. But something had begun to shift between the exchange of documents and intelligence. A recognition that beneath the uniforms and affiliations were people who had not chosen this war but were trapped within it. Marguerite told herself it was simply strategic. Understanding your source made them more reliable. Knowing what motivated Klaus helped predict his reliability. It was practical. She told herself this even as she noticed things that had nothing to do with intelligence. The way he smiled when a child in the park laughed, the careful gentleness with which he handled the documents as if respecting their weight, the weariness in his eyes when he spoke of the war that matched her own. Henri began to notice something was different. You're taking unusual risks with this source, he said one evening after a cell meeting. Meeting too frequently. Staying too long. The intelligence is too valuable to jeopardize, Marguerite countered. That's exactly my point. If this source is compromised, you're compromised. And you seem. He paused, choosing words carefully, less cautious than usual. She wanted to argue but found she couldn't. Because Henri was right. She had begun to look forward to the meetings in ways that had nothing to do with documents and everything to do with the strange relief of talking to someone who understood the impossible weight of living multiple lives. In early December, Klaus asked if she would walk with him along the Saône after their exchange. Not for intelligence purposes, he clarified. Simply to walk. It was snowing lightly, the first snow of winter, and the river looked beautiful. She should have said no. Every rule of resistance work, every security protocol, every instinct for self-preservation said no. She said yes. They walked in silence at first, the snow settling in their hair, their footsteps muffled. The city looked almost peaceful under its white blanket, the ugliness of occupation temporarily softened. What will you do when the war ends? Klaus asked quietly. It was the first time either of them had spoken of after. As if acknowledging that this could not continue indefinitely, that history was moving toward some conclusion that would render their strange collaboration obsolete. I don't know, Marguerite admitted. I've stopped being able to imagine that far forward. I think about it constantly, Klaus said. Going home. Seeing what remains. Trying to become someone other than a soldier. Will you tell people what you did? Helping the resistance. He was quiet for a moment. No one will believe it. A German soldier helping the French against his own army? They'll think I'm lying or mad. Perhaps both. Then why do it? Klaus stopped walking and turned to face her. The snow fell between them, delicate and indifferent. Because I am tired of being part of this machinery. Because I do not believe we are enemies in any way that matters. Because. He hesitated. I needed to believe I could be something other than what this uniform makes me. Marguerite looked at him, really looked, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not love, not yet. But recognition. The dangerous recognition that this person in enemy uniform was more human, more comprehensible, more aligned with her own values than many who wore no uniform at all. That night, walking home through snow-covered streets, Marguerite understood she had crossed a line she hadn't known existed. The war was no longer a simple narrative of resistance and occupation. It had become complicated by the unbearable presence of individual human beings making individual choices within a system neither had created. She had begun to fall in love with the enemy. And she did not yet know if this was the bravest or most treasonous thing she had ever done. Winter 1942 turned to spring 1943. The war ground on with the mechanical indifference of weather. In North Africa, Allied forces gained ground. In Russia, Stalingrad had fallen to Soviet troops, a defeat that rippled through German morale like frost through glass. In Lyon, the occupation continued its slow suffocation of ordinary life. The meetings between Marguerite and Klaus had evolved beyond their original purpose. They still exchanged intelligence. Klaus's information remained invaluable, helping the resistance save lives and disrupt supply lines. But the conversations had deepened into something neither could fully name. They talked about books. Klaus loved Rilke. Marguerite introduced him to Baudelaire. They discussed music. He missed hearing church bells that weren't regulated by German schedules. She missed café concerts where musicians played without censorship. They shared memories of childhood that revealed how similar their worlds had been before politics and armies divided them. Klaus told her about learning to ski in the Bavarian Alps, the silence of snow-covered mountains that felt like the world holding its breath. Marguerite described summer evenings on her grandmother's farm in Burgundy, fireflies in the vineyard, the taste of cherries stolen directly from trees. These conversations were dangerous. Not because they revealed military secrets but because they revealed something more destabilizing, their shared humanity. The ease with which they understood each other demolished the comfortable fiction that enemies were fundamentally different. By April, they had begun meeting without exchanging documents. Brief encounters where they simply walked or sat in the botanical garden talking about nothing that mattered to the war. Klaus had told his unit he was meeting a local woman, true enough in its way. Marguerite told her cell she was cultivating the source for long-term intelligence value, also true though increasingly incomplete. The first kiss happened in May, in the shelter of the greenhouse when a sudden rainstorm drove them inside. It was not planned. Klaus had been laughing at something she said, and she had turned toward him, and the space between them simply disappeared. For a moment the war ceased to exist. There were no uniforms, no occupation, no resistance. Only two people who had found each other across an abyss and decided, however briefly, that the connection mattered more than the chaos surrounding it. Then reality crashed back. Marguerite pulled away, her hand over her mouth as if she could recapture what had just escaped. I cannot, she whispered. This is impossible. Klaus's face was stricken. Marguerite. My people are dying. Your army is killing them. How can I? She couldn't finish the sentence. But she also didn't leave. She stood there in the greenhouse with rain hammering the glass above them, tears on her face, Klaus's hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. "I know what my uniform represents," Klaus said finally. "I know what Germany has done. What it continues to do. I cannot change any of that. But I can change what I do. Who I choose to be inside this nightmare. And what am I choosing? To betray everyone who trusts me? You're choosing to recognize that human beings are more than the flags they're forced to stand under." It was both true and insufficient. Because while their feelings might be genuine, the context was not neutral. Marguerite was French, living under occupation, actively resisting. Klaus was German, part of the occupying force, no matter how much he personally opposed it. The power imbalance was not erased by affection. In the weeks that followed, they continued to meet, but now with the acknowledgement of what lay between them. They were more careful, more aware of the risks. If they were discovered, Klaus would face execution for treason. Marguerite would be branded a collaborator, the worst label the resistance could assign. Both would lose everything. Yet they continued. Henry's suspicions deepened. "This source of yours," he said during a June meeting. "You're seeing them too often. People are noticing. The intelligence. The intelligence is excellent. Too excellent. Which makes me wonder why a German source would take such extraordinary risks to help us." Marguerite felt her stomach tighten. "Perhaps he has his own reasons for wanting the war to end. Perhaps. Or perhaps you've become involved in ways that cloud your judgment." The confrontation she had dreaded was approaching. Henri was too smart, too experienced to be deceived much longer. In July, the situation reached a crisis. The Gestapo began investigating leaks within the civil administration. Klaus learned his name was on a list of suspects. He had perhaps 2 weeks before serious interrogation began. He told Marguerite during a meeting in the Parc. His voice was steady but his hands trembled slightly. "I need to leave Lyon. They're offering me a transfer to Germany, administrative work in Munich. If I accept, I can disappear into the bureaucracy. If I stay, I'll be arrested within a month." "Then go," Marguerite said immediately. "Come with me." The words fell between them like a stone into still water. "That's impossible," Marguerite said. "I can't leave my family, the resistance, everything I know what I'm asking. But Marguerite, if I leave and you stay, they'll eventually trace our contacts. When they interrogate me, and they will, I may not be able to protect you. We would both be safer if we disappeared together." "Safer where? Germany?" "I would be a French woman living among Germans while France is occupied." "How is that safety?" Klaus had no answer. Because there was no good answer. Every choice led to loss, betrayal, danger. They sat on the bench in silence, watching the sun set over the Saône, the river turning gold and then gray. Finally, Marguerite spoke. "If I went with you, I would be abandoning my country when it needs resistance most. I would be choosing personal happiness over collective survival. How could I live with that?" "And if you stay?" Klaus asked quietly. "And we're both arrested? Both executed? What does that serve?" It was the central paradox of their situation. Their love did not exist in a vacuum. It unfolded against a backdrop of occupation, resistance, war. Individual happiness and collective responsibility were locked in irreconcilable conflict. That night, Marguerite barely slept. She lay awake in her small apartment, staring at ceiling cracks she had memorized over months of sleepless nights, trying to find a moral framework that could contain both her love for Klaus and her commitment to resistance. In the morning she made her decision. She would stay. She would continue her work. And she would help Klaus escape to protect both of them, even if it meant losing him. When she told him, Klaus did not argue. He simply held her hand and nodded. They met once more before his departure, in the botanical garden where they had first walked together. It was August and the roses were blooming despite everything. "I will remember this," Klaus said. "Whatever happens, whoever I become after the war, I will remember that it was possible to find something good inside something terrible." Marguerite kissed him goodbye with the taste of salt on both their lips. Then she watched him walk away, his gray-green uniform disappearing into the crowd, carrying with him something precious she would never fully reclaim. She had chosen duty over love. The right choice surely. The moral choice. It felt like dying anyway. The months after Klaus's departure passed in a blur of mechanical routine. Marguerite continued her resistance work with the same dedication, perhaps with even greater intensity, as if action could fill the hollow space his absence created. The intelligence Klaus had provided before leaving proved crucial. His information helped the resistance coordinate with Allied forces, disrupted German supply operations, saved civilian lives. Henri never learned the source had been a German soldier. The secret remained Marguerite's alone, a weight she carried without sharing. But something fundamental had shifted inside her. The clear moral certainty that had sustained her resistance work had fractured. She could no longer see Germans as a monolithic enemy. Every Wehrmacht soldier she passed on the street now carried a possible face, a possible inner life, a possible Klaus. This made her more dangerous and less effective simultaneously. More dangerous because she now understood the occupation with a complexity that sharpened her strategic thinking. Less effective because that same complexity drained the righteous anger that had fueled her courage. One evening in September, Henri assigned her a new task. A German officer would be dining at a specific restaurant. The resistance had learned he carried documents detailing upcoming deportations of Lyon Jews to camps in the east. Marguerite was to befriend him, distract him long enough for another operative to photograph the documents from his briefcase. It requires someone who can be convincing, Henri explained. Someone the officer won't suspect. The assignment was straightforward. The kind of operation she had executed successfully before. But as Marguerite sat in that restaurant watching the German officer enjoy his meal, laughing with his companions, she found herself paralyzed by questions she had never confronted previously. Who was this man? Did he believe in the deportations or simply follow orders? Did he have a family in Germany waiting for his letters? Was he Klaus in a different uniform, trapped in a system he couldn't control? Or was he fundamentally different, a true believer in the ideology destroying Europe? She executed the operation successfully. The documents were photographed. The resistance used them to help dozens of Jewish families flee before the roundups. Lives were saved because of what she did that night. But afterward, alone in her apartment, Marguerite could not escape the feeling that something inside her had calcified. She had learned to see enemies as humans, and now she had to treat humans as enemies. The dissonance was excruciating. In November 1943, the Gestapo increased their operations in Lyon. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, intensified his campaign against the resistance. Cells were penetrated, safe houses discovered. The network Marguerite belonged to lost 3 members to arrest and execution. Henri became more cautious, more paranoid. "We have a collaborator somewhere," he said during a tense meeting. "Someone is feeding information to the Germans." Everyone in the room looked at each other with careful suspicion. Trust, already fragile, began to disintegrate completely. Marguerite wondered if Klaus had been interrogated despite his transfer. If under torture he had revealed details about their meetings, about the intelligence exchange. She had no way to know. He had simply vanished from her life as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only memories and a moral confusion she could share with no one. In December, a letter arrived. It had been mailed from Geneva, neutral Switzerland, meaning someone had smuggled it across borders. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a few lines written in Klaus's careful handwriting. "I am safe. I think of you. The roses in Munich bloom differently than in Lyon. I hope you have found what you were looking for when you let me go. K***. She burned the letter immediately, basic security protocol, but not before reading it enough times to memorize every word. The message was simple but contained multitudes. He was safe. He thought of her. He understood why she had chosen to stay. And perhaps most importantly, he had found a way to send a message across enemy lines, proof that even in the chaos of total war human connection could persist against impossible odds. But the letter also forced Marguerite to confront an uncomfortable truth. She was no longer certain she had made the right choice. She had stayed to fight, yes, but was she fighting effectively anymore? Or was she simply going through motions, haunted by the ghost of what might have been? By spring 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion that would eventually liberate France, Marguerite had arrived at a strange place emotionally. She continued resistance work because it was all she knew how to do, because people depended on her, because stopping would mean everything she had sacrificed had been meaningless. But the fire that had driven her had transformed into something else. Not quite guilt. Not quite regret. More like a profound understanding that all choices in wartime are corrupted by context. That there are no purely good decisions, no actions without cost. She had learned that loving your enemy does not make them less your enemy. It only makes you more human, more capable of recognizing the tragedy of conflict. And she had learned that this recognition, this expanded moral consciousness, does not make things easier. It only makes the necessary hardness more painful to sustain. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. News reached Lyon through whispered conversations, forbidden radio broadcasts, the barely suppressed excitement in French faces on the street. The German occupation entered its death spiral. Orders became more desperate, reprisals more brutal. Klaus Barbie's Gestapo intensified their operations, knowing time was running out. Resistance cells that had survived years of careful operations now took increasing risks, sensing victory approaching. Henry's cell participated in sabotage operations targeting German supply lines. Bridges were destroyed, railroad tracks blown apart, communication cables severed. The work was dangerous but effective. Every disruption helped Allied forces advancing from the coast. Marguerite threw herself into the work with renewed intensity. If she could not reconcile her internal contradictions, she could at least act. Movement substituted for resolution. Action replaced reflection. In July, the cell received intelligence about a German convoy carrying fuel and ammunition through Lyon. Destroying it would significantly hinder German defensive capabilities in the region. Henri decided they would plant explosives on the route the convoy would take through the industrial quarter. The operation required careful timing. Too early and the explosives would be discovered. Too late and the convoy would pass through the populated center of Lyon, making civilian casualties inevitable. Marguerite was assigned to reconnaissance. She needed to confirm the convoy's timing and composition. The intelligence suggested it would include 3 trucks and a command vehicle. Standard Wehrmacht transport. She watched from a café window as the convoy assembled. 4 vehicles as predicted. Soldiers loading supplies, checking equipment. Officers consulting maps. Everything proceeding according to intelligence. Then she saw him. Klaus Richter, in Wehrmacht uniform, walking among the vehicles with a clipboard, clearly part of the convoy's administrative staff. His presence in Lyon was impossible. He had been transferred to Munich. He should be hundreds of kilometers away. But there he was, as real as the coffee cup trembling in her hand. The coincidence was too extraordinary to be accidental. Either Klaus had been transferred back to Lyon, unlikely given the Germans' usual administrative rigidity, or he had specifically requested reassignment. But why would he risk returning to a city where his past intelligence leaks might still be discovered? Unless he knew something. Unless he had information he needed to deliver. Unless he was trying to warn someone. Marguerite watched him for 3 minutes, her mind racing through implications. If she reported his presence to Henri, questions would emerge. Why did she recognize this particular German officer? How could she identify him at a distance? The careful fabrications surrounding her source would collapse. But if she said nothing and the operation proceeded, Klaus would be with that convoy when it exploded. She had perhaps 6 hours to decide. The choice was impossible. Warning Klaus meant risking the operation, potentially endangering her cell, violating every security protocol. Staying silent meant potentially killing the man she loved to preserve operational security. There was no morally pure option. Every path led through blood. Marguerite left the café and walked blindly through Lyon's streets, barely seeing the city around her. The liberation was approaching, but in that moment, freedom felt hollow. She was trapped in a cage built from competing loyalties, and whichever way she moved would destroy something essential. She thought of her father, the trembling hands, the broken dignity. The reason she had joined the resistance in the first place. Wasn't betraying that memory a kind of death too? She thought of Klaus's words in the greenhouse. Asterisk, you're choosing to recognize that human beings are more than the flags they're forced to stand under. Asterisk. She thought of Henry's trust, her cell members' lives depending on secrecy. The collective survival that individual feelings could not be allowed to endanger. By evening she had made her decision. She would tell Henri about Klaus. Everything. The truth about her source, their relationship, his presence in the convoy. Then she would accept whatever judgment her cell imposed. She arrived at the safe house where Henri waited with the other operatives. The explosives were ready. They would plant them after midnight, detonate at dawn when the convoy passed through. Henri, Marguerite said. I need to tell you something. About the source I've been meeting. The room went silent. Henry's face became very still. She told them everything. Who Klaus was, how long they had worked together, the intelligence he had provided, their relationship. She omitted nothing, knowing that partial honesty was worthless. She ended with his presence in the convoy, the impossibility of his being there by chance. When she finished, the silence in the room felt suffocating. Henri spoke finally, his voice cold with controlled fury. You've been compromised for over a year and said nothing. You've endangered this entire cell. You've violated every security protocol we have. Do you understand what you've done? Yes, Marguerite said simply. And this German officer. You believe he's trying to warn you? I don't know. But his presence is not coincidence. Then it's a trap. He was interrogated, gave up information, and now he's bait to draw out resistance members. Possibly, Marguerite acknowledged. Or he learned something about this operation and came to warn me. Even if true, we can't change the plan. Too many people are in position. The explosives are ready. And frankly, Henry's voice was hard, your judgment is clearly compromised. We cannot make operational decisions based on your feelings for a German soldier. He was right, of course. Strategically, morally, practically right. The operation had to proceed. I know, Marguerite said. But I needed you to know. Before. She couldn't finish the sentence. Before I potentially kill him. Before I complete the betrayal that loving him began. Henri looked at her with something that might have been pity. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. After liberation we'll decide what consequences follow. For now you stay here. Under watch. You don't leave this building. 2 cell members escorted her to an upstairs room. She did not resist. The door locked behind her, leaving her alone with the knowledge of what would happen at dawn. She stood at the window watching Lyon settle into darkness. Somewhere in the city Klaus was perhaps doing the same, looking at the same stars, thinking about the same impossible situation. At dawn the explosion echoed across Lyon. A successful operation. The convoy destroyed, German supplies lost, Allied advance aided. Resistance victory. Marguerite learned later that 4 German soldiers died in the blast. Klaus Richter was not among them. He had been reassigned at the last moment to different duties, a random administrative change that saved his life. But Marguerite did not know this for 3 days. For 3 days, she believed she had chosen duty over love and that love had been incinerated in the choosing. For 3 days, she lived with the certainty that she had killed the only person who had seen past her defenses to the frightened woman underneath. When she learned Klaus had survived, she felt not relief but an exhausted numbness. Because survival did not erase what she had been willing to do. The moral choice she had made remained unchanged by its accidental non-execution. She had proved finally which loyalty mattered more. And the proof felt like ashes in her mouth. Lyon was liberated on September 3, 1944. American and Free French forces entered the city to celebrations that felt both joyful and hollow. The occupation was over, but what it had required of people, the compromises, betrayals, moral contortions, could not be simply erased by flags and parades. Marguerite watched the liberation from the window of the safe house where she remained under informal house arrest. Henri had not yet decided what to do about her case. The resistance would transition into official recognition, resistance members becoming heroes of the Free France. But Marguerite's story was complicated in ways that did not fit the clean narrative of liberation. In the weeks that followed, France began a brutal process of accounting. Collaborators were arrested, tried, sometimes executed. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved publicly, paraded through streets in humiliation. The punishment was called tondeuses, the shorn ones. Marguerite understood that her situation fell dangerously close to this category. Yes, she had been a resistance member. Yes, Klaus had provided intelligence. But the relationship itself, the emotional involvement, contaminated the clarity of her resistance credentials. Henri visited her in early October. The war continued in Germany, but France was reorganizing, transforming from occupied to liberated territory. The provisional government is forming resistance credentials committees, Henri explained. They'll officially recognize members, provide documentation, allow access to positions in the new administration. And my application? Marguerite asked. Henri was quiet for a moment. Your contributions were significant. The intelligence you provided saved lives, aided operations. But the circumstances. Will you report the relationship? I have to. The committees are investigating collaboration thoroughly. If it emerges later that I concealed information, my entire cell's credentials could be questioned. Marguerite nodded. She had expected this. What happens then? Honestly, I don't know. Your case is unusual. You weren't a collaborator in any conventional sense. But you were romantically involved with an enemy soldier while conducting resistance work. How that's judged will depend on politics as much as facts. In the end, Marguerite's official status remained ambiguous. She was not arrested or publicly denounced. But she also was not granted full resistance credentials. She existed in a gray zone, neither hero nor traitor, recognized but not celebrated. Her family reacted with confusion and disappointment. Her mother could not understand how a resistance fighter could have loved a German soldier. The concepts seemed mutually exclusive. Marguerite tried to explain, but found no language adequate to convey the complexity of what she had experienced. Some former resistance members defended her. They knew her courage, her contributions, the intelligence she had helped secure. But others viewed her with suspicion, seeing in her story a troubling ambiguity that undermined the clear moral narrative of resistance. She found work as a clerk in a government office, a position far below her capabilities. She lived quietly, avoiding attention, carrying her memories like hidden scars. She never learned what happened to Klaus. Whether he survived the war, returned to Bavaria, built the different life he had spoken of wanting. The chaos of war's end and the rigid borders of post-war Europe made communication impossible. He vanished into history like millions of others whose stories were too complicated for the simple narratives of victory and defeat. Occasionally, Marguerite would walk through the Parc de la Tête d'Or, past the bench where they had first met, through the botanical gardens where they had talked about books and music. The roses still bloomed each summer, indifferent to the human dramas that had unfolded around them. She never married. When people asked why, she gave vague answers about being focused on rebuilding France, about not having found the right person. The truth, that she had found someone but the war had made their love impossible, was too complicated to explain, too likely to invite judgment. By the 1950s, as France rebuilt and moved forward, Marguerite's story faded from memory. Most people who knew about it had moved on, died, or chosen to forget. The war became history, simplified into neat categories of heroes and villains, resistance and collaboration. But Marguerite carried a more complex truth. She had learned that love does not conquer context. That individual goodness exists within systems that corrupt every choice. That the most difficult moral decisions are not between good and evil but between competing goods, competing loyalties, competing loves. She had chosen her country over her heart. The right choice, everyone said. The moral choice. But right choices can still destroy you. Moral choices can still exact costs that never fully heal. And sometimes the bravest thing is not choosing heroism but admitting that heroism itself is insufficient for the impossible situations war creates. Lyon, France. April 1973. Marguerite Moreau was 54 years old. She worked now as a librarian at the city's municipal library, a quiet job that suited her personality. She lived alone in a small apartment not far from where she had grown up, within walking distance of the Saône River. The war had been over for 28 years. An entire generation had grown up with no memory of occupation, no direct experience of the moral compromises that war demanded. To young people, the resistance was heroic mythology, the liberation a celebrated moment of triumph. Marguerite attended occasional reunions of former resistance members, though she always felt slightly separate from the others. They told stories of operations and near misses, of the satisfaction of having fought for freedom. She listened and smiled and said little. On this particular April afternoon, she was reshelving books in the history section when a patron approached. He was elderly, perhaps 70, walking with a cane. He spoke French with a slight German accent. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm looking for materials about the French resistance in Lyon during the occupation." Marguerite looked up and felt time collapse. Klaus Richter stood before her, older, grayer, but unmistakably himself. The same eyes that had looked at her across a park bench 3 decades earlier. The same slight smile that had once made her believe human connection could survive impossible circumstances. "Marguerite," he said quietly. Simply her name, nothing more. They went to a café near the library, the conversation of 30 years compressed into an awkward silence as they walked. What do you say to someone who represents both the best and worst moments of your life? Klaus had survived the war, returned to Bavaria, worked as a teacher of French literature. He had never married. He had spent years trying to reconcile his service in the Wehrmacht with his opposition to what Germany had become. He had finally written a memoir, small and probably unread, documenting the internal resistance of Germans who had quietly opposed the regime from within. "I came to Lyon to visit the places we knew," Klaus explained. "To remember. To try to understand what we were to each other." "And what were we?" Marguerite asked. Klaus stirred his coffee, considering. "Two people who found each other in a nightmare and tried to be human inside it. I don't know if that was love or just desperate recognition that someone else saw the world as impossibly complicated. Does it matter which? Perhaps not. What matters is that it was real. That for a moment, the war did not dictate everything." They talked for hours, filling in the gaps of 3 decades. Klaus told her about his mother's garden, which had survived the war and bloomed each spring with stubborn beauty. Marguerite described her work at the library, the quiet satisfaction of helping students find information, of connecting people with knowledge. Neither spoke of regret. Regret seemed inadequate for choices made under such extraordinary pressure. They had done what they believed was necessary, even when necessity destroyed possibility. As evening approached and they prepared to part, perhaps for the final time, Klaus said something that Marguerite would remember for the rest of her life. "I spent years wondering if I had done the right thing. Betraying my uniform, helping the resistance, loving you when everything said I shouldn't. And I realized there was no right thing. There was only being human inside in humanity. Choosing connection when everything demanded isolation. That's all we can ever do." Marguerite nodded, feeling something inside her that had been frozen for decades begin, finally, to thaw. "Thank you," she said. "For finding me again. For showing me that the war did not erase what we were." They embraced briefly, 2 elderly people on a Lyon street, carrying inside them a story too complicated for history books but too true to be forgotten. Klaus returned to Germany. They exchanged letters occasionally over the following years, brief notes about books and gardens and the persistent memory of roses in wartime. Marguerite continued her quiet life at the library. But something had shifted. She began, tentatively, to speak more openly about her experience. Not at official reunions but in smaller, more intimate settings. She talked to students researching the occupation, to historians interested in the complexity of resistance. She told them about moral ambiguity. About loving the enemy without losing yourself. About choosing between competing goods rather than between good and evil. About how the bravest resistance sometimes happens inside your own heart, against your own certainties. Most did not understand. The war had been simplified into clear narratives. But a few listened and recognized something true in her story. A truth about humanity that transcends politics and flags and the neat categorizations that history prefers. When Marguerite Moreau died in 1989, her obituary listed her as a librarian who had participated in resistance activities during the war. It mentioned nothing about German soldiers or impossible choices or love that defied context. But among her possessions, her family found letters. Letters from Bavaria, written in French, filled with references to gardens and books and shared memories. They found a dried rose pressed between pages of Baudelaire's poems. They found a photograph of a young woman sitting on a park bench, smiling at something just outside the frame. These objects told a different story than the official histories. A story about two people who refused to let war define the limits of their humanity, who loved despite every reason not to, who chose connection when separation was required. It was not a story of heroism or tragedy. It was simply a story of being human in a time that demanded you become something less than human to survive. And in the end, that might have been the truest resistance of all. The war taught Marguerite that certainty is a luxury afforded only to those who don't have to make impossible choices. That clear moral frameworks collapse under the weight of actual human complexity. That the bravest thing sometimes is not fighting but acknowledging that fighting extracts cost from your humanity that victory cannot repay. She learned that love in wartime is not redemption. It does not make anything better. It only proves that even in hell, humans remain capable of recognizing each other across abysses of circumstance and ideology. And she learned that this recognition, painful, complicated, insufficient, is all we have against the machinery of history that would reduce us to types, to categories, to simple narratives of good and evil. The roses in the Parc de la Tête d'Or still bloom each summer. The Saône River still flows through Lyon, carrying the same light that Klaus and Marguerite watched together when they believed, briefly, that human connection might be stronger than war. It wasn't stronger. War won as war always does. But for a moment, in stolen meetings, in whispered conversations, in the impossible choice to see your enemy as human, they had created something that war could not fully destroy. And that, perhaps, is all any of us can hope to do, to remain human when everything demands otherwise. To love when love is impossible. To recognize each other across the barbed wire of history and choose, however briefly, to remember that before we were enemies, we were simply people who wanted to live. The war ended. The occupation ended. The clear moral certainties of resistance and liberation faded into the messy reality of post-war life. But what remained, in letters and pressed roses, in memories and small acts of courage, was the proof that even in war's worst darkness, human beings can still surprise each other with their capacity for connection. It wasn't enough to change the outcome. But it was enough to prove that outcome is not the only measure of meaning. And sometimes that has to be sufficient.